It's the Acting Income Podcast with Ben Hauck, Episode 2, How to Sort Out All of the Advice You Hear as an Actor.
It's the Acting Income Podcast with Ben Hauck. Turn your passion into income, Ben will show you how. With all the resources that you need to make it as an actor in an expensive city. To stay balanced and make money, you really can't go wrong with actingincome.com.
Welcome to the Acting Income Podcast. I'm Ben Hauck, and on this podcast we talk about acting, money, balance, and tons of other topics related to earning an income as an actor. I want to thank you for tuning in. Without your ears, my mouth has no purpose, except maybe to chew. This episode is episode 2, titled, How to Sort Out All the Advice You Hear as an Actor. Pull up the show notes right now at actingincome.com/episode 2. Now, before we dig in, I want to thank today's sponsor, the book Long-Form Improv. Long-Form Improv deftly teaches the wildly popular form of improvisation that is so foundational to the comedy stylings of many of today's top actors and thriving comedians. Crammed with innovative ideas for conceptualizing improvised scene work and finding the game of the scene, this crisply written manual covers techniques for experienced improvisers, curious actors, and even non-actors, even teaching the most famous expression of long-form improv, the half-hour improvised form known as the Herald. Students of acting and improv alike should expect the book Long-Form Improv to bolster their education and fast-track their course to improv greatness. To reserve your copy today, also available on Kindle and Nook, go to actingincome.com/LFI. This episode is about how to sort out all of the advice you hear as an actor. And it comes from my experience of teaching long-form improv. When I was a student of long-form improv, I heard one little rule that really haunted me, and that rule was this. The only rule of improv is that there are no rules. It sounds really cool, and it makes improv sound really cool as well. But when you try to teach that kind of rule to students, it can be quite confusing. I know it's very confusing for me to hear that the only rule of improv is that there are no rules. Wait, isn't that a rule? Doesn't that mean there is one rule? I don't quite understand. Well, in my book, Long-Form Improv, I address that issue. And I address it in the second chapter, which is titled Rules versus Principles. And I think there's a lot of advice that chapter can provide to actors as well. In that chapter, I define what rules are. Then I go on to say what principles are, and I say that both rules and principles are instructions. Let me define a few terms here. Instructions are lessons learned from past experience, aimed at making the present experience less wrought with conflict. Let's just imagine yourself stepping out for the first time onto an improv stage. You have no script, you have no lines, and you have no guidance. Well, that's why you take an improv class, so that you can get some guidance on what to do when you step out onto a barren stage. Most of that guidance is provided from lessons learned from the past. So instructions that you're given in those classes are just lessons, and they're lessons learned from past experience, aimed at making the present experience, like stepping out onto an improv stage, less wrought with conflict. Now, rules and principles are two different kinds of instructions. What's a rule? A rule is a kind of instruction that always applies. When it comes to rules, there are no exceptions. They always apply no matter what. Now, a principle is a kind of instruction that applies in general, but not always. So, principles allow for exceptions. So, rules are stricter than principles. You follow a rule, and you can train your unruly behavior. However, rules can be harmful. Strict observance of instructions, meaning seeing instructions as rules, can sometimes get you in trouble. You can miss the times when the rules shouldn't apply. So, let's take an acting example. Say, for instance, that you're on a stage and you're following a rule that you were taught that, let's say that you should always commit to character. This means that you keep your character even if, say, someone gets injured on the stage, or if a par can drops from the ceiling, or if there's a fire that goes on, that you keep your character. Obviously, that application is ridiculous, but if you are a rule-based kind of actor, you would commit to your character even through that fire raging through the theater. Now, a principle has exceptions, a rule does not. So, if you followed committing to your character as a rule, you would never make an exception. However, if you followed it as a principle, you would allow for exceptions. An exception like, maybe I'll drop my character if there's a fire raging in the theater. Now, that's really helpful when you're listening to acting teachers and casting directors and agents and managers and other actors telling you what you should and shouldn't do. When they tell you things, when they give you advice, it's going to sound like a rule that you should follow. It's going to sound like, oh, there's not really an exception to that. The thing is, most of the time, when people are giving you rules, they're not really giving you rules. They're giving you principles, meaning the things that they say probably apply in general, meaning more than 50% of the time, but they don't always apply. The thing is, they won't tell you that they don't always apply a lot of the time. People won't say that. They'll try to convince you that it always applies, but more than likely there's going to be some asterisk next to that they're not talking about, meaning it's a principle and not a rule that they're teaching you. This is not to say that principles don't have value. In fact, they are very valuable. Being a principled person is fantastic and generally regarded, and it shapes your own acting and your choices as an actor. But it doesn't mean that you have to be ruled by the instructions that you're taught. Instead, embrace the instructions. Maybe if you find them great, embrace them more than 50% of the time. Maybe embrace them 80% of the time. Maybe embrace them 95 to 99% of the time. But at times, allow for exceptions. When you allow for exceptions, you allow yourself to adapt to the sometimes unusual reality that you're presented with that the rules had no concept of when they were formulated. So, in order to sort out all of the advice you hear as an actor, I would recommend listening to them as principles rather than as rules, because when you follow them as rules, you'll take them to ridiculous extremes, but when you follow them as principles, you keep your sanity. This episode is sponsored by the book Longform Improv, the complete guide to creating characters, sustaining scenes, and performing extraordinary heralds by Ben Hauck. Reserve your copy today at actingincome.com/LFI. The show notes for this episode are available at actingincome.com/episode 2. You can find Acting Income on Twitter and Facebook. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, check out actingincome.com/advertise. I'm Ben Hauck. Thanks. See you on the next episode. For more information, as always, check out actingincome.com.